Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Thank you for turning out on this rather gloomy Parisian summer evening. There's certainly no weather like this in Katie Kitamura's new book. Katie Kitamura's sun-bleached and unsettling third novel, A Separation, tells the story of a young woman who travels to Greece on the orders of her mother-in-law to find Christopher, her husband, from whom she is recently and secretly separated. When she arrives at Christopher's hotel, however, she finds only his absence. What follows is an exquisitely controlled meditation on what draws people together and what drags them apart, and which, beyond the mystery of what has happened to Christopher, questions how much you can ever expect to know the person with whom you share or shared your life. The Independent said Katie Kitamura fearlessly strips back facades and plunges depths, calling A Separation a beautifully written powerhouse of a novel that defies all expectations. And Karl Ove Knausgaard said, A Separation is a novel so seamless that follows its path with such consequence that even minor deviations seem loaded with meaning, declaring it wonderful. As well as contributing to numerous publications, among them the New York Times, Wired and The Guardian, Katie Kitamura is the author of two previous novels, Gone to the Forest, which was a Book of the Year in the Financial Times, The New Yorker and the TLS, and her debut, The Long Shot, a book about mixed martial artists, which was a finalist for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award, and that led Tom McCarthy to assert Hemingway's return to life, and this time he's a woman. Please join me in welcoming Katie Kitamura to Shakespeare and Company. And so we're going to begin with a short reading from A Separation, and then Katie and I will be discussing the book. So over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for coming here tonight. It's really incredible to be reading here. I really feel myself to be among friends. So Adam set up the book so wonderfully. I don't think I need to tell you anything about it. I'm just going to read a few pages from the very beginning. It began with a telephone call from Isabella. She wanted to know where Christopher was, and I was put in the awkward position of having to tell her that I didn't know. To her, this must have sounded incredible. I didn't tell her that Christopher and I had separated 6 months earlier, and that I hadn't spoken to her son in nearly a month. She found my inability to inform her of Christopher's whereabouts incomprehensible, and her response was withering but not entirely surprised, which somehow made matters worse. I felt both humiliated and uncomfortable, two sensations that have always characterized my relationship with Isabella and Mark. This despite Christopher often telling me I had precisely the same effect on them, that I should try not to be so reserved. It was too easily interpreted as a form of arrogance. Didn't I know, he asked, that some people found me a snob? I didn't. Our marriage was formed by the things Christopher knew and the things I did not. This was not simply a question of intellect, although in that respect Christopher again had the advantage. He was without doubt a clever man. It was a question of things withheld, information that he had, and that I did not. In short, it was a question of infidelities. Betrayal always puts one partner in the position of knowing, and leaves the other in the dark. Although betrayal was not necessarily the primary reason for the failure of our marriage. It happened slowly. Even once we had agreed to separate, there were practicalities. It was no small thing, dismantling the edifice of a marriage. The prospect was so daunting that I began wondering whether one or the other of us was having second thoughts, if there was hesitation buried deep within the bureaucracy, secreted in the piles of paper and online forms that we were so keen to avoid. And so it was entirely reasonable of Isabella to call me and ask what had become of Christopher. "I've left 3 messages," she said. "His mobile goes directly to voicemail, and the last time I rang it was a foreign ringtone." She pronounced the word foreign with a familiar blend of suspicion and pique. The words returned to me then, phrases spoken over the course of the marriage. "You're foreign. You've always been a little foreign. She's very nice, but different to us. We don't feel as if we know you." And then finally, what she would surely say if Christopher told her that was over between us. "It's for the best, darling. In the end, she was never really one of us. Therefore, I would like to know where exactly is my son." It had been a month since I'd spoken to Christopher. Our last conversation had been on the telephone. He had said that although we were clearly not going to be reconciled, he did not want to begin the process. He used that word, indicative of some continuous and ongoing thing, rather than a decisive and singular act, and of course he was right. Divorce was more organic, somehow more contingent than it initially appeared, of telling people. Could we keep it between us? I had hesitated. It wasn't that I disagreed with the sentiment, The decision was still new at that point, and I imagine Christopher felt much as I did, that we had not yet figured out how to tell the story of our separation. But I disliked the air of complicity, which felt incongruous and without purpose. Regardless, I said yes. Christopher, hearing the hesitation in my voice, asked me to promise. Promise that you won't tell anyone, at least for the time being, not until we speak again. Irritated, I agreed, and then hung up. That was the last time we spoke. Now, when I insisted that I did not know where Christopher was, Isabella gave a short laugh before saying, "Don't be ridiculous. I spoke to him 3 weeks ago, and he told me the two of you were going to Greece. I've had such difficulty getting hold of him, and given that you are clearly here in England, I can only assume that he has gone to Greece without you." I was too confused to respond. I couldn't understand why Christopher would have told her that we were going to Greece together. I had not even known that he was leaving the country. She continued, "He's been working very hard. I know he's there on research and..." She lowered her voice in a way that I found difficult to decipher. It might have been genuine hesitation or its mere facsimile. She was not above such manipulations. "I'm worried about him." This declaration wasn't immediately persuasive to me, and I didn't take her concern with much seriousness. Isabella believed her relationship with Christopher to be better than it was, a natural mistake for a mother to make, but one that on occasion led to outlandish behavior on her part. Once, the situation might have elicited in me a feeling of triumph. That this woman should turn to me for help in a matter concerning her son might have meant something as little as a year ago, as little as 6 months ago. Now, I listened mostly with trepidation as she continued. "He hasn't been himself. I called to ask if the two of you again, it was clear she knew nothing, that Christopher had not confided in her, might like to come and stay in the country, get some fresh air. That's when Christopher told me that you were going to Greece, that you had a translation to finish, and that he was going to do research. But now," and she gave a brief sigh of exasperation, "I find that you're in London, and he's not answering his phone." "I don't know where Christopher is." There was a slight pause before she continued. "In any case, you must go and join him at once. You know how powerful my intuition is. I know something's wrong. It's not like him not to return my calls." There were outcomes to Isabella's telephone call that are extraordinary to me even now. One is that I obeyed this woman and went to Greece, a place I had no desire to visit, for a purpose that was not in the least but evident to me. True, Christopher had lied to Isabella when he said that we were going to Greece together. If he didn't want to tell his mother about the separation, it would have been easy enough to come up with some excuse to explain why he was traveling alone, that I had to go to a conference, that I was spending time with a girlfriend who had 3 children and was therefore always in need of both help and company. Or he could have told her half the truth, the start of it at least, that we were taking time off. From what or where, she might have asked. But he hadn't done any of this, perhaps because it was easier to lie, or maybe because it was easier to let his mother make whatever assumptions she wished to make, although misapprehensions, after the fact, were especially difficult for Isabella. I realized then that we needed to formalize the state of affairs between us. I had already decided to ask Christopher for a divorce. I would simply go to Greece and do the deed in person. I supposed it would be my last dutiful act as her daughter-in-law. An hour later, Isabella called to tell me which hotel Christopher was staying at, and the record locator for a ticket she had booked in my name, departing the next day. Beneath the unnecessary flourishes of character and the sheen of idle elegance, she was a supremely capable woman, one reason why she had been a formidable adversary, someone I had reason to fear. But that was all over, and soon there would be no battleground between us. Still, I noted that she evidently didn't trust me. I was not the kind of wife who could be relied upon to locate her husband, not without a ticket in hand and a hotel address. Perhaps it was in response to this patent distrust that I kept my promise to Christopher, the second surprising outcome of Isabella's call. I did not tell his mother that we were separated and had been for some time, the one piece of information that would have excused me from going to Greece altogether. No mother would ask her daughter-in-law to go to Greece in order to ask her son for a divorce. I could have stayed in London and gone about my business. But I did not tell her, and I did not stay in London. If Isabella knew that she had purchased a plane ticket in order for me to ask her son for a divorce, I suppose she would have killed me, actually slain me then and there. Such a thing was not impossible. She was, as I have said, a supremely capable woman. Or perhaps she would have said that had she known it was so easy to separate us, to dissolve the terms of our marriage, she would have bought me the ticket long ago. Before she hung up, she advised me to pack a bathing suit. She had been told the hotel had a very nice pool. Thank you.
Thank you. Often when I discuss novels with writers, I might ask them to present the principal characters of the book, but I realised that it was kind of difficult for me to get you to do that, because on the one hand, Christopher is defined to a certain extent by his absence, and on the other hand, our narrator, I mean, in the extract you wrote, you talked about things withheld. Mm-hmm. And she is certainly a narrator who withholds a lot of details about herself. So in the extract you read, we found out she was a translator. We found out she was foreign compared to the British people around her. But beyond that, we don't really get very much. So I think I'll probably come to the characters a little bit later, and maybe in a slightly oblique way, and begin with, I guess, one of the things about the novel which is very clear, and that's the setting. Mm-hmm. So you've given us the setup in the extract you read, and so she's heading off to Greece. First of all, could you just describe the area of Greece she goes to? Tell us what region it is. And
she travels to a part of Greece called the Mani, and it's the very southern bottom of the. It's in the southern Peloponnese, at the very bottom of the kind of tip of the country, and it's relatively remote. It's quite a long drive. It's not one of these. It's not especially touristic. It's quite a rugged landscape, and I actually spent 3 weeks there almost a decade ago, I think. And I had such a strong sense that it was a landscape that was awaiting a character in some way. And when I went home, and I kind of and the landscape stayed with me, and then eventually a character came forward, and then the narrative came from the character. But it kind of followed in reverse order in that sense. I didn't have a sense of a story, and then a character who could carry that story, and then the setting that would maximize that narrative. Instead, it kind of emerged out of that landscape. And I mean, I should say that it was quite a particular time in my life when I was there. I was in my 20s, and my father had been sick with cancer for, I don't know, maybe by that point 5 or 6 years. And it was while I was there that I remember it was kind of a break. I was working, but it felt like a break from my life, and I accepted that. I didn't accept that he was going to die, but I accepted that he was not going to get better. And so that landscape was really suffused with this sense of dread for the coming event, which I knew would happen, and then the sense of almost anticipatory grief. And so that sensation of a grief that isn't correctly located is really important to the book in some way, because a lot of what I want to think about is how we grieve when we don't have a kind of regular narrative or regular kind of schematic to follow. And so I think I experienced some of that from the landscape. So it is really central to the book. And
in addition to that, when the novel takes place, and perhaps this was the case when you were there as well, the land has been scorched.
Yes, that's absolutely. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing because I think I'm not a fan of research, and so almost everything that happened in the book, I mean, apart from some large parts of it, but all the kind of almost incidental things about setting in that region, I all experienced them. I experienced all of them on some level. And when I was there had been, it was actually, so I stayed in this Yerlimenos, which is a little port town on the shore, and then as you moved in, which was pretty much untouched by the fires, but as you moved in, it was suddenly the entire inland, the entire landscape was almost black. Mm-hmm. And it was really surreal. It was like a lunar landscape. It had formed these kind of undulations across the hills, and there was almost no vegetation. And then the vegetation that was there was genuinely surreal. It was there were some cacti that had melted, so it was as if it was all in a Dali painting. So it looked like this act that was so immense that it had to be almost natural, or what we think of as natural. But in fact, it was arson, and there had been these fires all across that part of Greece, and they had been set deliberately, and it was some kind of feud between various people. So that was also a really interesting juxtaposition for me.
And there's something, I guess, enormously symbolic in a way of this idea of sort of scorched earth. It's really like life presenting you with a very
scorched
useful
earth
metaphor.
Policy of their marriage. I suppose.
What just speaking more generally, because I think a separation comes in a sort of a tradition of sort of Mediterranean novels, and particularly novels set in Greece. I mean, whether that be the writings of Lawrence Durrell or John Fowles, or even further back. And I was just wondering, what do you think it is about this particular region that inspires storytellers?
I mean, I think there is this sense that there's a layering of history and narrative that's very unavoidable, and there is this, I mean, you come across the fact all the time that everything there has a narrative that has been actively constructed in some way. The mythologies of the place, the traditions, everything has this very long history, and so there's this kind of accretion of stories and context and background that reverberates around you. So it's not something that in this book I think I direct this. I didn't want to do a kind of, swerving into bits of kind of tourism, cultural tourism, in a way. I didn't want to refer to those narratives, but I think they're still there, and so it gives you this very rich atmosphere to kind of write in, I suppose.
And of course, it's become almost a form in itself. This novelists who take, for example, a mythological story and retell it in maybe in a modern setting or something like that, which this absolutely isn't. And yet, at the same time, and maybe it's because as a reader I was looking for these kind of mythological resonances because it was set in Greece. But it did feel very much to me that there was this sort of there were these resonances there. So even in the extract you just read, where before she gets to Greece, when you talk about Isabella, she could have slain me on the spot, I think it is, which feels like a very sort of a mythological action in itself. Was there a sort of a conscious influence of any of the sort of the strains or the rhythms of Greek mythology as you were writing?
I mean, I think the thing that is most culturally specific, that was almost became a structure for the book, is the phenomenon of weepers, which is not necessarily specific to Greece, but is, I think, very much associated with Greece. And that, and I read Patrick Leigh Fermor's wonderful book on Mani, which, if anybody's interested in the region, you should read. It's an incredible history and piece of travel writing. But I think I wanted to find what felt simultaneously very old and quite contemporary. And the weepers, so I don't, if you're not familiar with this phenomenon, it's women who are paid to issue lamentations at funerals. So they go to funerals and they kind of wail at the procession, and I think they are accompanying the body to the afterlife, but on a kind of more, if not cynical, but on a more practical level, I think, they're performing grief for the bereaved. And so that was really interesting to me, because it felt like simultaneously this is something that is a tradition that is very ancient, that is very local, but at the same time seemed to speak to something in our contemporary culture which has to do with the displacement of emotion and this question of how we perform our emotions. So I think that was how I wanted to try to engage with it. So it was more kind of structures rather than narratives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's this, there is that sort of, the juxtaposition of this kind of very sort of primeval, almost sort of atavistic practices alongside, I mean, the hotel she's staying in.
Yes.
In a way, the hotel is almost I guess it's sort of a haven of modernity in a way.
I mean, I find luxury hotels, or hotels in general, but they're kind of amusing, because it feels like for the very wealthy, the ultimate comfort is to feel exactly the same wherever you are. So a kind of luxury hotel wherever you are has exactly the same thread count sheets and the same towels and the same toiletries, and that is what comfort is for a certain class of person, is to travel great distances and find that you have not traveled at all. It is in the linen. So that was something that I wanted to play with. So she doesn't leave the hotel that much. So and she's also a character who's, she's very aware of the class systems that are at play, but she herself is not untainted by all of that, and she's very much one of these, she is one of these privileged people who come to a place that is, on the brink of financial collapse, and stays in her luxury hotel.
And this was a luxury hotel that so Christopher was staying in.
Yes.
She goes out to find him, and as we said, when she gets there, he's not there.
He's not there. No.
And I guess when I was reading it, I did reflect back on the title immediately when she arrived, and he wasn't there, because of course the separation could refer to their marital separation,
yes.
but also of course when she arrives and he's not there, we think of the physical
yes.
separation
yes.
Between them. But then I was thinking, so a separation, it's not the same as an absence. Actually, a separation requires sort of 2 points of reference with sort of differing levels of distance between them.
Yes.
And that distance seemed to be a crucial part to the novel for me.
Yes.
Sort of distance from the people who, in theory, you should be closest to.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really elegantly put the way you describe the fact that it relies on 2 points of view. And I think actually that kind of bifurcation, for me, the title, I mean, it refers to a number of things in the plot, of course, but it's really the separation within the central character. And I think she has, she's not who she is pretending to be. So, they haven't told anybody about their separation. And she chooses to continue to play the role of the wife, even though she's not exactly his wife any longer. And I think that idea of the roles that we play and how it's very easy to believe that it's very distinct, my true self, my inner life, which is, sacrosanct, and then these roles that I merely play. But I think the truth is that the more and more you play a role, the more that boundary dissolves. So I think initially when I was thinking about the title, it was really that separation that was within her, but I think it comes to collapse, which is the trajectory that in a way was the one I was most invested in trying to tease out over the course of the book.
And there's also the roles that we play, and of course this I think connects to this sort of this juxtaposition of the ancient and the modern again, because of course marriage as an institution has existed since time immemorial, and it's something, there's a lovely turn of phrase, I noted it down, it's described as a crazed wager at a moment in a book, this idea of sort of throwing yourself into something which maybe from a modern perspective doesn't make a great deal of sense. And I was just wondering if you could reflect for a little bit on that, on the role of what one expects from a marriage and what one gets ultimately, the role that plays in the book.
I mean, there's a really lovely little Alain Badiou book, which now, God, the title is escaping me, but in it he fundamentally says that love is almost the only radical act that is left to us, precisely because it is so and marriage, in fact, this bond which is which now can be broken quite easily, it is almost an act of radical faith, because everything is against you when you go into it, and I think I really liked that idea, because it is a kind of gesture of madness, and I think it's almost I think it's really changing now, but for a long time it was presented as an inevitability, but I think when this decision to be with one person for the rest of your life is completely crazy, if you unless there's this kind of societal, unless there's a kind of need in terms of your infrastructure around you, that is what keeps people together. But now I've lost track of the question. Sorry. Well, it was what you get in a marriage, or just that sort of I guess the separation between what you project onto the union and what you expect, and then what it actually delivers in a way. And there are moments when the narrator reflects upon the sort of, I guess in a way, when you set your sights so high, when you do something so sort of reckless and powerful, then ultimately you're building yourself up for disappointment on certain levels, and it's something that she seems to struggle with. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I actually wrote a draft of this novel, I would say right after I got back from Greece, and it was in the third, so this was like 8 years ago, and it was in the third person, and it didn't work, and I put it away. And then about 3 years ago, I, for whatever reason, came back to it. I never looked at the old, I don't know where the old draft is, and I rewrote it in the first person. And then it suddenly came very quickly, and I found the voice for it, and something about the unreliability of her story was what kind of made, for me, made the material work. So, but there were key. So the basic outline of the plot stayed exactly the same. Everything was the same. The characters are the same. What happens is the same. But I think, you know, a lot of things happened in my life between those two periods. I got married, and then I had children, and so it was really interesting in rewriting. And again, I haven't looked at the old version, but you know, my sympathies shifted slightly. So I became quite fascinated by the terrible marriage, not of the central character, but of her in-laws. And the fact that it is, you know, I think at some point she says it was a kind of, in her vanity as a newly married woman, she never imagined that her marriage could be as bad as that. But of course her marriage was much less successful than that. And I think this kind of, you know, when you are married, you see those marriages, and they are extraordinary, even when they don't seem entirely to work. They have a logic that is unknown to you, and even the very privacy of that logic is something that is really interesting. And I suppose similarly with the mother-in-law, who is kind of the villain of the book in some way, you know, and she has this fierce over-attachment to her son. But, you know, of course, then I went and had a son, and I'm completely over-attached to my son, and I'm already like, please don't leave. So, you know, when I say, you know, he had a tendency to overestimate her intimacy with her son, I mean, that is going to be me in, you know, probably 5 years at this rate. You know, so it's interesting that how, you know, because you do age as a writer, and how that even when it's the exact same material, it does kind of, your point of view does shift. So, and
the particularly, I think the tussle between the narrator and Isabella, her mother-in-law, is obviously inevitably over the affections of Christopher, and there is something, I think, with the narrator that even though they have gone through this separation, they haven't initiated divorce yet, and there's and in fact you write about that, the way that sort of even uttering the word divorce then therefore sets life and the relationship on a kind of an unchangeable course. But there does seem to remain with the narrator a fascination, at least with Christopher and the character. Like she, even though she has is trying her best to be cold about it and to be quite detached, she can't help herself.
Yeah, he was kind of an interesting character to write, because he is my, you know, he's a character in the book. I mean, I never think about my characters this way, but if I were to think about my characters, he's a character I would probably want to actually spend time with. You know, he's my kind of favorite character, so to speak. You know, he's intelligent, he has charm, and he's not without depth. But the challenge of the book was, because I didn't want to, I didn't want to write a narrative that would kind of in a more classic way relate the history of their relationship. So I didn't want to present their glory days, and then, you know, and then things went a bit bad, and then they went worse, and then they went... I only wanted to write what she would feel and think about in that moment. And so the challenge was to try to create a character who would remain appealing in some way, but only seeing him through a character who's thoroughly disillusioned by him in some way. So I think part of it, but, you know, one of the trajectories I knew I wanted to happen in the book was that she would in some sense fall back in love with him once. Sorry, I've just rammed into a kind of plot spoiler. But I wanted her to fall back in love with him over the course of the book in some way. And so I think he had to be not completely disgusting, basically, but moderately so.
It's interesting that that's almost ramming into the plot spoiler, because it's a book which it's difficult to have I think a very in-depth conversation with, about assuming that at least some of you here haven't read it and not wanting to spoil it for you, because there are elements of the book, I think particularly near the beginning, which seem to borrow codes perhaps from from thrillers, perhaps. Maybe that thriller might be overstating it a little bit, but certainly that sort of dynamic. So I'd be interested to talk just a little bit about the sort of genre influence, but also the style of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are two things to say. Is that one, I was very conscious of the fact that I wanted to write something that would be a rebuttal to all these narratives which are based on kind of which the foundation is the body of a dead woman, and
of which there are many.
Of which there are many, particularly in film and television. I mean, the dead and mutilated body of a woman is a pre-credit kind of a scene, and then you move into the really interesting stuff, which is often, I mean, really interesting in quotation marks, which is often the male consciousness, the male character and mind that is going to go look for that woman and find out what really happened to the woman and uncover her secrets. And so I think, I wanted to write something that would do the opposite. So the missing character would be a man, and the mind that would explore that would be female. So I think because of that, there's inevitably these thriller-ish nods in the beginning of the book. But I really also didn't want to write I wanted to try to write a book where narrative tension was not relying on plot, and so where the big reversals in the book would actually be, despite the large plot spoiler, would be in the point of view and the understanding and the emotional landscape of the of the central character. So where the kind of the tension would come from small shifts internally rather than external events that acted upon the central character.
And I think people would have got a good sense also from the reading that you gave of the, I guess, the tone and the style, which to me seems perfectly suited to the story and to the character. And I think it's sort of compared to your first two novels. I mean, we could see to a certain extent that it's the same writer, and yet you've clearly made some stylistic decisions to I guess to anchor the voice to the story. And I was just wondering, did that come quite naturally in the writing once you had a sense of the voice of the narrator, or was that something which you had to almost kind of theorize before getting it on paper?
I think it came quite naturally, but this is the first thing I've ever written, first piece of fiction I've ever written in the first person. So that was a really big shift for me. And it was also a novel that I have a tendency to over-edit, and my first two novels were very edited. There were, I don't know how many drafts, many drafts. And I knew that with this one I wanted to try to leave some messiness in it, and I wanted the sentences to be much looser, and so it's interesting reading from it, because it on some level it doesn't feel like a book that's meant to be read aloud. It's a book that takes place on the page, and there's a lot of sentences within sentences within sentences that are quite difficult to read. A friend of mine did the audiobook, and I think it was a challenging experience for her. But so that, I think but it came quite easily, and then the real challenge was to not go back and edit it and make it, because I think I just found myself, it's interesting kind of writing for a the longer you write, I suppose, I don't know how to say it. But it's, you find your own tics, and you find your methods of avoidance, and it felt to me that I had to kind of develop quite a compressed prose style, what Tom McCarthy is referring to in that quote, compressed writing style. But I knew that what was actually happening is I was taking things out because I couldn't quite work out how to make them work on the page. So there was maybe like a turn in a thought that I couldn't quite execute well, and I would look at the sentence and it wouldn't work, so I just take it out. And I was editing away, and it felt to me that it was a form of almost avoidance and hiding, and it's much more exposing to write sentences that don't quite work and that try to get a complicated thought and maybe a contradictory thought or emotion onto the page, and to let it sit even though it doesn't complete, and to walk away from it on some level. So I wanted to try to capture some of that looseness and messiness on the page. And I think for me as a writer, that has more than anything to do with confidence. I think, you know, over editing for me was a sign of some kind of lack of confidence, maybe, but I think I now feel confident enough to let the book have its problems.
And it's interesting, you talk about tics, and I as I was reading, there was one word I noticed which came up not sort of many times, but maybe every 10 pages or so, the narrator would refer to something as absurd. And it struck me sort of, it was something she would use about different people, or about situations, or about a response to something. And I think one of the reasons I picked up on it was because for me anyway, when I think of absurdity, I think of something kind of wildly unreasonable, almost like loud, noisily unreasonable. And because I think there is an underlying level of absurdity to a lot of the actions and a lot of the situations. But it seems to be in some way sort of a quiet absurdity. And I was just wondering, was that was this idea of absurdity something you had at the back of your mind?
I mean, there are a couple scenes in the book that I definitely wrote because I was trying to think of the most awkward situation I could put my central character in. There's a scene when she's having dinner with somebody who she believes has slept with her husband while he was in this hotel, and it's like a complete scene of extreme passive aggression where she won't say what, or I mean, I think she does say, I actually can't remember, I think she does say in the end, did you sleep with him or not? But you know, it's like pages and pages of she's not saying what she feels, and she's observing everything very closely and resenting everything to the hilt. And that was definitely written as a situation that was relatively absurd. But I think for her character, because it's so much about voice and how she is seeing the situation, I think when she says that's absurd, it was absurd. That is actually her way of pushing the scene away from her, of kind of introducing distance between herself and what is taking place around her. But of course, what's taking place around her is her life, and that is her problem, so to speak, as a character, is that she is unable to enter into the domain of her own emotions on some level, and that's why the weepers, for example, are almost emblematic of her psychological state, where she's unable to express directly what she is feeling.
I thought the weepers were an incredibly sort of powerful image in the book, and there's one particular scene where the narrator experiences an example of this, and just the sort of the clarity with which it was written. I was wondering, is this something which you have physically experienced? You've seen it?
Yeah, I have. I saw it, and I saw it in I would say, you know, out of context. So it wasn't actually at a funeral; it was a performance. But it was incredibly moving, and I think I could not doubt the authenticity of what I was seeing. I could not doubt the authenticity of her feeling as she was doing it. Even though, as in the book, the woman is sitting there, and she's smiling, and she's making coffee and making jokes, and then suddenly she's like sobbing, and that was exactly how I experienced it. But you know, it was a performance, and it's very related to theatre in that sense, and to Greek theatre in particular, this notion of catharsis. But I think what she is doing, the weeper is doing, is not so distinct to what you are trying to do in a novel. I think nobody is under the illusion that what is, you know, this is a piece of paper and some words. Nobody thinks this is the real stuff of life, but you are trying, despite the intense artifice of this entire thing called fiction, you're still trying to access some kind of real emotion, if possible, within it. So that was definitely something that I was thinking about. I mean, they are extraordinary artists, really. They are like actors, or there's a wonderful performance in New York very recently by an artist called Taryn Simon, and she organized these kind of hollow pillars, and she had weepers or mourners from around the world come, and they would each go into these pillars, and they would perform at the same time. So you had 11 different kind of lamentations issuing out into this huge hall in the Armory, and then there was a really interesting choice she made where you walk in and it seems very remote. It's this cacophony of grief, but then in order to really experience the piece, you would have to go into the pillar itself, and then you would be as close as we are to this person who is performing, and it's incredibly uncomfortable. You feel as if you are impinging upon their privacy. You feel completely like a voyeur. You feel like there's something very wrong with what you're doing, but at the same time, of course, this is a performance and they've been paid. So it's she kind of accessed a lot of really interesting ideas there.
And I think this connects in a way to what you were saying earlier about having written a first version of this book a long time ago and then come back to it several years later, because I think with the idea of the Weeper, in a way, it's something when maybe you first hear about it, maybe at a relatively young age as well, the idea might seem quite absurd, for example. And then, I mean, there's a moment in the book where the narrator comments that at a certain age, death was all around you. And I think there is that that element of these kind of ritualistic actions, and these the things aren't quite as simple as genuine grief or performed grief, and just sort of understanding the nuances in people's reactions to things.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I think about a lot, which is the pressure we are put upon to perform our emotions all the time. And I think it's... I mean, I don't know if it's quite... I mean, then I think about Coriolanus, and it's not only women. But, I mean, you know, there's a lot of pressure on women in particular in our culture to perform their emotions. So, I'm thinking my husband wrote a novel who's reading here next week, but he wrote a novel called Gods Without Men, and there's a character in the book which is a young couple. They're a couple and their child disappears, and it's loosely, if not based, inspired by the Madeleine McCann story. And there's this incredible criticism of the mother, because she wouldn't cry on television, and this pressure for if she would show us her pain, then we would try to help her and find out what happened, and that kind of pressure to publicly perform your grief, when in fact when you are grieving, it is almost the last thing you're going to do is to break down in that way. And I often think also the Krzysztof Kieslowski film Blue, Three Colors Blue, where the central character is mourning the death of her husband, and she's not able to cry until the very end of the film, and then that's the end of the film. And that's a kind of that she's she's enacted the passage, she has reached, she's been able to move into her grief. She's been able to inhabit her grief in some way. And I think this character, for various reasons, has not that path to kind of claiming your grief is blocked.
Now, I could go on picking your brains for quite a while yet, but I know we are running out of time, and I suspect there will be questions for you. So if you do have a question for Katie, just raise your hand. We'll get the microphone to you. If you have already read the book, please do try and avoid plot spoilers for anyone who hasn't. Otherwise, who would like to kick us off? Don't be shy. Yeah, this gentleman just here. We'll get the microphone to you.
Just listening to you, you are funny, but the first passage that we heard, there is no humor until the very last line with the pool.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you were talking about the tone, and also in your intro about this seamlessness. Was it something you were consciously trying to keep out because of the seriousness of the topic, or... I mean, is that part of the editing? Like, oop, there was a little funny irony there. I need to get rid of that.
It's a really interesting question. It's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't think I write funny, but I always find my books very funny to myself. So my last book, which is, I think, in fact, when I was talking to Kanalskar Karlova, who published the book in Norway, and I said, I think it's quite a funny book, and he said, it is not funny. He said, it is not funny. But to me, it's funny. I mean, there are situations that have the strange. I don't know. Is it funny?
I think there are some moments. I mean, the lunch scene, for example,
yes.
It's incredibly awkward to read, and yet at the same time, I was laughing aloud to it. I mean, there was. I mean. Perhaps because I was so uncomfortable, but I just...
I mean, that's definitely not something that I have taken out deliberately. but it's funny because sorry to keep talking about my husband. He's working on a novel, and he's an incredibly funny person, and he's effortlessly funny on the page. And he's working on a novel now. God, he'll kill me for talking about a work in progress. But he's working on a novel now, and he said, "I'm not going to do jokes. I'm just not going to do jokes." And he says, "There are no jokes. It's not funny." And he read it aloud, the first chapter, at a thing he had to read at, and the audience just could not stop laughing. They're just on the floor, and then after that, I said, "It's just why work against your natural gifts? I mean, you are funny. Just be funny, and you can be funny and melancholy at the same time. There's no contradiction in it." But having said that, I think the humor that I put into the books is sometimes perhaps too personal. I don't know. But thank you. That was a really interesting question.
Hopefully this is okay to ask, but I was just curious about your journey as a writer.
Yeah.
However you want to take that question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I wish I had a kind of great story about it, and I don't, and I accept, and it's not interesting. But except that I started writing pretty late in relative terms. I mean, I started writing in my mid-20s maybe. And the first piece of fiction that I wrote was a novel that I then published. So it's been funny because I think I actually haven't written any fiction that has not been published, and so that is why, to some extent, maybe why the books are so different on some level, because there is some finding. This is the first thing I've written in first person, and I now teach fiction, and it's, I'm making all my students write in first person and third person and second person and first person plural, and they're doing all these voices and they're experimenting with that. And I didn't do an MFA, so it's literally the first time, the first piece of fiction in the first person is the first sentence in this book. So it's not a particularly distinguished path to being a writer, but it's to being a fiction writer. I mean, the only thing I can say is that I read intensively as a child, and I think everything I remember from my childhood is books, really. And I think what I think of my life, I think a lot of what I think I've lived is really just what I've read in books.
So some writers say that you should never write what you know.
Yes.
That's the worst thing to do. So
yes.
How much would you say that your own experiences
yes.
have influenced the
yes.
book? And do you write
yes.
what you know? Is that?
Yes. No, I mean, so my first book, which is about, as I think you might have mentioned anyway, it's about mixed martial arts, which is cage fighting, which is not from my own personal experience. And it was, it was the first piece of fiction I wrote, and I thought, I thought, I'm not going to write what I know, and I'm going to try to write something very different. And of course, it was after I finished the novel that I realized it was entirely about, I trained I studied classical ballet relatively intensively up until I was 17, and it was entirely about that training and about that kind of, I thought I was going to become a dancer, and I gave it up, and it was that kind of disappointment of something that you hope to achieve, that no amount of effort was going to get you to that place. That's very much in that first book. And so it was only after I finished writing it that I realized that was what that book was about. And so I think it's interesting. I never really understand how my own biography is in the book until I'm done. But in the case of this book, it was really that narrative about grief is very much what it's still. I think my last book was about that as well. They're both books that I think are about the death of my father on some very, very fundamental way. And it's been interesting. I've been writing a lecture that I have to give in Rome next week, and it's and I've been looking at this book by Peter Handke called A Sorrow Beyond Dreams, and in that book he writes about his mother's suicide 7 weeks after she committed suicide. And so he makes this decision to write about it at once. And that's almost the opposite of what I feel capable of doing. I think it takes me many, many years to figure out what I was feeling back there. But it's this ability to write in real time is something that now feels increasingly important to me, especially because of the political climate we're in. I think, this is not something that I want to wait 8 years to think about on some level, even though my natural tendency as a writer is is to let it kind of sit around and percolate. So the challenge of pushing yourself to write about your if not emotions is such a soft word somehow, but to write about what is happening happening to you internally before you are ready is a really interesting challenge, because there's no doubt Hanke was not, on an emotional level, not ready to sit down and write about his mother's death, and yet that tension is actually what makes the book really extraordinary. So.
Hello.
Hi.
Did you say that you purposely avoid in your book talking about the reason or the circumstances for the separation? Because I think it'll be a question in the reader's mind to know how this came about, separation.
I mean, I think there are relationships that I do think come apart for reasons that neither person is entirely able to identify. But I would think that in the case of this novel, the reason is clearly his infidelity, and I think her disavowal of that quite clear reason is part of what is her. Yes, yeah. So there's a kind of but she says, but that's not why we just grew distant. But I think that the reason is kind of very obvious on one level, but I think it's her. I think she's a proud character, but her refusal to acknowledge that is a very simple reason is one of the facets of how she understands what happened between them.
I think we've got time for one more question. Who would like to ask? No? Okay. Oh, there we go. We'll just grab a microphone.
You can use mine. Do you want to use mine?
Yeah.
Okay.
You've spoken about this a little, but could you elaborate a little more on the early draft in the third person, the later draft worked in the first person? Could you elaborate a little what didn't work before and what did work later?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I should look back at it and see how bad it is, because but I can't quite bring myself to do that. But I think one of the, and it's really interesting, not really interesting, but it's interesting to me, the way people have responded to the book, because, for example, my Italian editor said to me that she thinks there's a way of reading the book in which you can read the entire thing as if she is a guilty party of committing the crime that is at the middle of the book, which never occurred to me. But when you read it through, she's actually completely right, because it's a first-person narrative, and she is an unreliable narrator, and she withholds. There's a lot about withholding, but she withholds a lot of information from the reader as well, and she comes out quite well in the end of the book. So I think that element of unreliability and undecidability was what I think made the kind of bare bones narrative more interesting to me, because I think there's not a great deal that happens on one level in the book, but I think when you have that undecidability of to what degree she is really being honest with the reader, then that became more interesting to me to write, if that makes sense.
I should say as well that I don't read reviews of books until after I've formed my own feelings about them. But one thing that really struck me about the reviews that I read just earlier this afternoon, actually, was just how different the takes on the book were, actually. People seemed to come at it from completely different angles, to take different things from it. I felt that I had taken quite different things from all of the reviews that I read, and that struck me as quite a rare thing, actually, for a book to inspire certain reflections, such diverse reflections among people.
It's funny. I think you don't know what. There was a review that came out very early on in the New Yorker, where there was a lot of emphasis on the coldness of the narrator, and then I went on book tour directly after that, and everybody said, "Do you think she's really cold? Is she that cold? How cold is she?" and then, but now, and then you kind of. you don't necessarily. I don't think I necessarily intended to write her as an incredibly cold character, but of course she is. And it is really only after you've written a book that you realize what you've done, and I think that coldness for me really has to do with a kind of almost traumatic response, and it has to do with this, preoccupation that's clearly very personal for me, but with grief and with that kind of netherland that you inhabit before you are able to properly grieve. And so that was a dominating psychological state of the character, and I think it is a kind of extreme coldness and inability to, this emphasis on being rational, this dismissal of the absurd is a kind of terror of this abyss of emotion that really, I remember when my every time my dad was sick, and every time I would think about the fact that he was ill, it was like a precipice, that I was lying on the very edge of a precipice, and I could almost see it right behind me. And something about this character, that is where she is situated, and so she cannot turn her head, because then she will tumble into it. And so that's why there's this kind of extreme rationality, and this kind of like everything is quite procedural in a way with her.
Yeah. And so now is the time for you all to buy it and read it and make your own impressions. Thankfully, we have copies for everyone. They're waiting for you at the till. I'm sure Katie would be happy to sign copies for you. It's really a sort of fascinating, compelling read. It really sort of draws you through it. The authorial voice is so strong and so sort of intoxicating. Almost, I was rereading it last week when we were almost up to 40-degree temperatures, and it felt like the perfect kind of climate as well. So if you're looking for something for the summer as well, it'll sort of almost provoke hallucinations in you. So do pick it up. Do stick around as well. We're going to be serving wine as usual. Get your book signed, chat with us. Otherwise, please join me one more time in saying thank you to Katie Kitamura.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you so much.